Hello. Today I'd like to talk about natural disasters and conflict and delve into some fundamental puzzles about how natural disasters can affect political stability, either positively or negatively. This week is the last part in a larger discussion about the drivers of civil conflict. This natural disaster week has a lot of similarities with the weeks that we've covered so far in parts 1 and 2. And today we're going to look at how man made and natural disasters can have direct and indirect effects on the likelihood of conflicts starting or conflicts that are already ongoing lasting longer or potentially ending, as a conflict could potentially bring different groups together. And this is the last concrete example of different environmental factors that the literature has looked at when researchers are trying to understand how the environment and background structural or climate conditions can affect political stability and conflict. And I think this is a really interesting week in trying to look at big things that can happen in our world that we credibly could not have an effect on, and how these kind of background outside exogenous factors can shape our political worlds in developed and developing countries. And this connects to the semester-long effort for us to try to take a step back and look at how these events that we read about in the newspaper or that we live through ourselves can have direct consequences on how people live their lives and the likelihood of conflict in a number of regions around the world. And there is going to be a couple of themes through today, connecting to previous weeks, that the world is changing, that we do see natural disasters that could be credibly linked to climate change are increasing, as well as the ebb and flow of natural disasters like earthquakes that climate change couldn't. We haven't found links between climate change and those kind of quick onset natural disasters. These are climate charts from the Canberra airport, and as we see here, the average temperature has increased. The anomalies are all showing that we're getting hotter. The graph down below, I think, is more sobering for me, as you can see that the number of days above 38 degrees Celsius or so didn't really exist before 2000, but now we have they're relatively common, maybe not every year, but more frequently. And so this is one example that we've already talked about how climate conditions can affect people's quality of life, their ability to be secure in their jobs, their livelihoods, be able to take care of their families, but also its ways to try to connect between the lives that we live in developed countries like in Australia, in the United States where I'm originally from, but try to connect it to events that can still reach and affect countries like Australia, who might not think that they would be as susceptible to earthquakes like neighboring New Zealand or California, where I'm from, or Japan, as we saw with the dramatic earthquake there a few years ago. And so this leads me to the 1989 earthquake off of Newcastle in New South Wales. Probably existed before a lot of you were actually born, but it was a 5.6 on the Richter scale earthquake. 13 people died, 1,000 people displaced, and over a billion Australian dollars in damage. Coastal town affected by an offshore earthquake, one in which is not the largest that we've seen by far, but there was quite substantial damage, in part potentially due to the lack of building conditions to be able to expect these kind of things from happening, as well as just what might be susceptible to damage given a larger than expected earthquake. Another kind of natural disaster that we're living in right now, of course, is a global pandemic. we might think that nothing like this has really happened in our lifetimes, and there have been the avian flu, Ebola, other viruses that have posed a threat to the international system in the last couple of decades. Nothing like the Spanish flu that happened a little over a century ago, or with the coronavirus pandemic that we're living through right now. The Spanish flu pandemic actually originated in the United States, but it definitely was felt much farther afield, including in Australia. We had around 15,000 people die. About a third of Australians were infected, and around the world, between 50 and 100 million people died of the Spanish flu pandemic in the space of a year. So a shorter time frame than what we've been living through for a little over the last 2 years. Other natural disasters that are going to be relevant for the discussion today would be the Black Friday bushfires that I know some of my students I've talked to lived through and remembered directly, if they were based down in Victoria. 2009 bushfires that led to 180 fatalities. Of course, in Canberra, we had widespread bushfires that destroyed a lot. It came quite close to parts of central Canberra in 2003. But I think bushfires are something that we might think of as more a natural disaster that we would be susceptible here in Australia. I was in Canberra, of course, in 2000, in which we had that horrible summer bushfire season. And it is one of those natural disasters that have become increasingly common. I showed several weeks ago now the global map of live fires around the world. You can go to, I'll put a link in the description, and see where fires are happening around the world. I've seemed to have come from one horrible bushfire destination and moved to another one. From California. This headline was from a couple of years back. We really haven't seen peak bushfire season in California, although there are a number of really bad bushfires now happening in New Mexico in the United States. And so you have different regions of the world that have to worry about certain types of natural disasters more than others. In Australia, it would be more bushfires than earthquakes. In California, I was raised and lived through earthquakes that were greater in the size of the Newcastle earthquake, but we didn't really expect that many bushfires in Southern California. Now we see a lot more of them there, but it is one of those kind of patterns. And I know a lot of students who are taking this class are looking at natural disasters and how they affect human security and conflict, because they are quite dramatic. A lot of them are quite sudden, and they can have substantial impacts on national level economic growth as well as individual level human security. How much we have to adapt to these kind of changing circumstances can be much greater than we might have expected in the past, especially as the IMF and others are estimating that certain types of natural disasters are going to become more common as the world changes over the course of this century, which kind of leads me to today's puzzles that I really want to try to work through. Australians would consider we have to nut it out. That natural disasters are both unpredictable and relatively regular occurrences, that you're not exactly sure when they're going to happen, but that they are predicted to occur in certain parts of the world, like bushfires in Australia, floods in Bangladesh, plagues in certain parts of the world. But that why hasn't the international system come up with more effective means to prevent, mitigate, or adapt to these kind of disasters? Because again, you see billions of dollars of damage in both developed countries like in Australia or California that would have the resources to be able to recover quickly. But what happens when these disasters happen in countries that are still trying to economically develop and catch up with the developed world, and how that might set back their human security, and what extent to which the international community has been able to help different countries that are more susceptible to disasters to be able to be ready for when they actually strike. And the other kind of puzzle for me that kind of connects this literature that we read for the class and our discussion for today to something that's actually going on besides bushfires and earthquakes and things that might be seen as a normal kind of natural disaster and not think of a global pandemic. When I first started teaching this class in 2016, heck, when I taught the class in 2019, a global pandemic was definitely not on the list of my worries about what would be most likely to happen. Bushfires would definitely be higher up there. So why haven't we seen a broader political turmoil connected to the coronavirus pandemic? There definitely has been individual level responses, protests, as we're going to be talking about, but that there really hasn't been a huge spike in the number of conflicts due to this increasing level of difficulty in people's day-to-day lives than we would expect, given what we've read back in week 2 about the economic causes of conflict. So those are the motivating puzzles that we're going to be working through over the course of today. And the main motivating question for me when trying to think about natural disasters and conflict, of course, it would be a great class that I could teach an entire term on the relations between natural disasters and human security and conflict and other kind of political implications of natural disasters, but we don't have the time. So today I'm just trying to touch on some of the more influential literature that we're going to read, as well as some influential cases that help shape how people think about the relationship between natural disasters and conflict. So today's question: what effects do natural disasters have on human security and conflict? And as we read this week, that you have arguments for why natural disasters should potentially, they very rarely have a positive effect on human security, but in the relations to conflict, some people argue that they should be an opportunity to bring people together, and that should lead to more cooperation and less violence, while others suggest that that could lead to grievances, dissatisfaction with how the government has responded, and that could potentially lead to more conflict, which leads me to my first lecture question for this week. So I've linked in the playlist for this week's lectures an Al Jazeera video talking about the 2020 Pakistani floods. The readings today talked about more about the 2010 floods, because some of these articles came out before the 2020 floods, but I think there's some interesting parallels as well as connections to, in both the 2010 and the 2020, how people responded by criticizing different levels of government responses. So I encourage you, it's only like a 2.5, 3 minute video. Their description of the Pakistani floods and people's voices of frustration. What tensions, and the question I'd like my students to answer on Waddle, or for those of you who are not taking the class, in the comments below, what tensions related to disaster preparedness does this video highlight between the Sindh and the national governments? So this is one of several videos looking at visceral nature and the size and scale of these natural disasters in a way that I think is really hard to explain unless you live through them. We all now live through the global pandemic, but that's more of a long, slow-burning natural disaster, while things like earthquakes, floods, or tsunamis would be seen as more quick onset disasters. So the lecture question is about the first one. The other ones are just a couple minutes each, looking at Pakistani flooding back in 2010. So you can see some parallels between how people responded a decade apart, and then video of earthquake hitting Nepal in 2015. This video is from Bhaktapur Square, one of the main tourist places to visit, the traditional old part of the city of Kathmandu, or the Kathmandu area, and just seeing these temples that I have went to a number of times destroyed. It was really heartbreaking for me, kind of like the cathedral in Christchurch in New Zealand after that collapsed with the earthquake a few years back. And then the last one is some raw video of the rather insane tsunami videos that came out after the earthquake off the coast of Japan, which we're also going to be talking about. in the next video. So let's turn to those, and we'll come back and we'll start defining our terms as to what people consider a natural disaster, how many different types there are, and then once we have that kind of foundation, mention a couple of examples, then we can start to theorize about what effects that might have on the human political world.